So, good morning, everyone. And what we're going to do today, I'm going to spend about 10 or 15 minutes talking about emotional development. And then I'm going to spend the about, I don't know, the majority of the class talking about adolescence. And when we talk about adolescence, we're going to focus mainly on junior high and high school. And then at the end of class, probably the last 15 or 20 minutes, I'm just going to kind of leave it open for any kind of questions that anyone has. Um, the the midterm exam, I'll be entering those grades manually today and tomorrow. So you should have already gotten your grade as soon as you finish the exam, but I'll be putting them on Moodle. So I know sometimes people don't see the grade immediately because the site that I use for the exam is not connected to Moodle, so it doesn't record the grade. I have to do it manually. So if you don't see a grade, doesn't mean you didn't take the exam. It just means I haven't put the grade in yet, and I usually wait until the exam's fully closed. Okay. Can everybody see this?
Yes.
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 Good. All right. I'm going to go through a couple of things. Most of this is very basic, and one of the reasons why I like to talk about emotional development is when we think about working with people clinically. Um, there's usually um, some emotional disturbance that's going on with them. There's also cognitive issues that are happening that are also connected to emotion, but there's something about emotions themselves that feel kind of icky to people, or they just don't feel comfortable. And so, one of the things that we as clinicians need to be trying to get better at is sitting in some of that uncomfortable feelings. So, because sometimes there's very uncomfortable emotions that people are feeling or expressing or not expressing that you can still feel. So, I like to spend a little bit of time talking about just a couple of things about emotional development. And so, when we look at emotions in general, there are a couple of different levels to think about when it comes to emotion. There's a primary emotion that's happening underneath, and then there's a secondary emotion that usually is the what we see, and it's a lot of times it's a lot easier to um, put your finger on um, for the most part. At the same time, if we can help someone identify and process the primary emotion, you have a lot better chance of helping them kind of make change if they want, or growth if they want, or work through something that's really difficult for them. And especially if those primary emotions are tied to maybe specific events or experiences in their life, and especially if there's like for example, like a deep-seated fear or sadness or hurt or feeling alone, if those are tied to something, if you can help them process that, it really goes a long way towards helping them kind of get past or work through some of those really tough emotions. So, as an example, um, with say being angry, and I actually show this to clients when I work with them on anger, or talk about with them, and this this is just like a visual depiction of anger, for example. So if we think about primary and secondary emotions, the same can be said of um, anger. There's things that we see on the top, kind of like an iceberg. Um, you see the top of the iceberg fairly easily, but what's underneath is usually a lot bigger and it's harder to see because it's obviously beneath. And the farther we kind of go down, you can tell, like if we get down here into the hurt area or regret or feeling insecure or feeling offended, that's a lot of times what's powering the anger up, or powering what you actually see. And so, um, if we, I kind of talk about it like this. If you think about the Titanic, most people know the story of the Titanic. It's a pretty common story at this point, and there's been, obviously movies made about it. They didn't sink. The Titanic did not sink because of what they saw. They saw the iceberg and they tried to turn. What the reason they sank is because everything that was underneath. That was what they couldn't see, what was really difficult for them to kind of get around. And so, um, sometimes what we see at the surface is not necessarily all the things that are going on underneath. And so when we think about things like anger, especially, we kind of want to figure out exactly where that anger is coming from. So this would be just an example of like a primary, secondary kind of emotion, kind of what it looks like. There's always something we can see at the top potentially, but there's also things we don't know yet that we kind of want to ask questions about. We've talked a little bit about, like last class we talked. So some of this will be review. We talked about, like, as we first start feeling certain emotions and then expressing them, and we talked a little bit about the way that expression of emotion is, influenced by parents' responses to childhood behavior. And I think a lot of it's because parents see one thing, um, that is maybe at the surface, or hear one thing at the surface, but there might be other things going on underneath. And especially if the younger the child, the harder it is for them to communicate. It's very difficult for children to communicate their emotions anyway. And so sometimes when parents see things that they perceive as something going on, there might be something else going on underneath. And we're going to talk more about that with teenagers as well today. And so, uh, one of the things, and we talked about this a little bit last time, like regulating, learning how to regulate emotions can start early. And it is a skill that you can build and you can get better at it over time. I find that with, I don't know, most of the clients I work with, when we start talking about emotion and what they are, and how we can process through them, and then validate the fact that they feel emotions strongly, because everyone feels emotions, but sometimes people have a hard time putting their finger on what the emotion is. And so sometimes when you're working with folks, if you can kind of help them understand, yeah, you're feeling big things right now, it seems like, are you able to put your finger on it? If you can help them start putting their finger on what their feelings are, what their emotions are, you have a lot better chance of at helping them, to regulate and start to soothe themselves. As you go from middle and late childhood, which is kind of where we left off last time, into the adolescent world, you begin to have a lot better understanding of emotions because you've been feeling them for a while. You've watched them on other people for a while. You've probably had conversations about them at some point with somebody. And so you have the understanding that you can have more than one thing happening, or more than one feeling happening. And sometimes you can have more than one emotion in a particular situation, or a particular experience. And so you also are becoming more aware of events that lead up to certain emotional reactions. So those things are starting to really come online as we get into late childhood, and especially for our discussion today with with adolescence. You have a very, pretty good awareness of the emotions themselves. Might be able to you might not be able to always put your finger on it, but you feel it and you can start to describe it. You can also start concealing it or suppress it. You can also start hiding things. Um, you can redirect your emotion towards someone else, which kind of starts in childhood, but kind of really comes on board as you get into adolescence and into adulthood. You also have this capacity for genuine empathy, which is really kind of a cool thing, because empathy is one of the great connectors with human beings. And if we have time today, there's a video that I've put on Moodle that we will watch today about the adolescent brain. I don't know if we're going to have time, but it's on Moodle. Some of you might have already watched it. It's a very good. It's a TED talk from an institute in the UK. She does a really good job of describing empathy when it comes to the adolescent brain versus the adult brain. Um, I think I just kind of show this just to kind of give you a visual that potentially what might be happening when it comes to like being emotionally triggered, let's say. And this is again not to say that our cognitions are absent during this time. They're not absent at all. We definitely have thoughts that are happening and potentially behaviors that are happening. In this kind of visual here, you can see that if you have an event trigger, whatever that trigger is, a situation that occurs, there's typically that primary emotion comes in quickly. If you are able to have a, a vulnerability, share a vulnerability, and have a level of intimacy with someone, you kind of work through that primary emotion. You typically have also get an emotional connection with that person, and you're able to calm, or they're able to help you calm. If um, if it feels too overwhelming and you don't want to share it or you don't want to connect, that secondary emotion will come to the top where you that's something that other people can see. And sometimes when we think about anger, it doesn't always have to be verbal, like yelling or throwing things. It could be just quiet too. You could just shut down. You could feel numb, but you get kind of protective from experiencing, and you start to feel like I don't really like feeling this, and so sometimes you can start blocking those things out. And so what happens is you might start attacking or criticizing or demanding things or blaming, when what's actually happening is your primary emotion is so triggered that it hasn't been soothed. So you might actually start to push people away to a certain extent. And keeping in mind that this isn't like one time this would happen, this would be a pattern over time. And sometimes people realize they have this pattern and try to work on it, and sometimes people don't. And so this is just one example of kind of what happens with us. The hard part about this is like that took me about a minute and a half or 2 minutes to describe. The hard part about this type of emotional reaction is it happens within seconds or less. Sometimes it's really quickly. And the more we go one path or the other, the quicker that process happens too. That's the hard part about it. Sometimes working with clients, when you tell, let's say that someone's shut down, sometimes we just need to slow down a little bit and allow them space because they're probably processing it, but they're processing it in a way that they don't like and doesn't feel good. And maybe they're having a trouble describing it or talking about it. They can't give words to it. Sometimes that means we just need to slow our process down for them so that they can kind of maybe catch back up a little bit. That's especially true if we're trying to, create new patterns, let's say with emotional reactions or responses. I've probably said this before, that emotions are data, they're not directives. They don't tell us what to do. It feels like they do. And we can feel something really strongly, but it might not actually be true. Um, and so, whenever we feel emotions, they are trying to tell us something. If we look at it in terms of like curiosity, like what's it trying to say? Like, what am I trying? I feel something right now. I wonder what's going on, or what's it trying to say to me, or why do I have an urge to act in a certain way because of it? They don't necessarily have memories either. Um, they have a context that they live in, and so what that means is if you're 8 years old and you have a certain event that happens to you or around you, you might have a certain emotion that comes with that. When you fast forward 30 years, even 40 years, 50 years, you could have a very similar emotion, but a totally different context. The issue could be that if, depending on that first emotional reaction that you had when you're 8, it could start. or continue to like pull you backwards in time instead of keep you in the present, which is kind of one of those powerful things about emotions. Um, because they don't have memory, we need to give them a context. We need to give them a place that they're living in right now in the present. Um, they're very normal. It's okay to have them. It's okay to feel them. It's okay to sit in them. And we're going to talk about this directly today. It's okay to feel in and sit in them. I don't know that it's always okay, and especially clinically speaking, it's not okay to just let people languish in them without trying to help them process it and move forward. And you can do that in multiple ways. Move forward also doesn't mean get over it and move on. That's not what that means. At the same time, if we get really good at helping people experience their emotion, feel the emotion, describe the emotion, that's great. We also want to help them process it and make sense of it and start to add some more of the cognition pieces into it so that they're not always just languishing in it, so that they can self-soothe and they can start taking responsibility for how they're feeling or what they're thinking. And so recognizing it, naming it, kind of feeling it is the first part of the process. The second part is how do we help them move forward, even when they don't feel like they want to. And so we're going to talk about some of that today with adolescents. We'll talk about that probably a lot more specifically with that with adulthood in our last class. Okay. Does anyone have? I know this was like literally a 20-minute version of something that's very, very complex. Does anyone have any question about this part? Because we're going to move into like a group activity here in a second. But do you have any questions about anything that I'm talking about right now? And I think I forgot. If you do try to say something, just make sure you turn your mute off. And you can always put questions in the chat as well.
I have a question. Can y'all hear me?
I can, sure.
Okay. The I've heard it before, but I guess it just struck me today. The data, emotions are data, not directives. Would you mind sharing a time maybe that you helped someone walk through that idea of I'm so angry, that's why I do this, and then letting go of that directive and helping them see that it's data and maybe moving forward past that? Maybe just an example.
hmm So, yeah, anger is a good one. That's a good one to talk about.
Yeah.
Um, I'm going to make some assumptions. Everyone here has been angry before. Um, so if you're angry, there's always a reason, first of all. And we don't have behaviors for no reason either. And so that's very important to keep in mind clinically. Um, sometimes the anger, I'm going to make up a couple of scenarios. It's potentially that the anger, let's say, is from a hurt, maybe an insecurity. I had this conversation with a client recently. It was on the job, and his supervisor was saying some things to him, and he found himself getting more defensive. Then finally, kind of later, getting really angry about it. And as we talked through it, he felt like he was feeling insecure about his job for really no reason for him. Because what we did was, and this is where you can add context to something, it's okay to feel that insecurity. And he started to realize that that's what it was, which is good. But I didn't let him just sit in the insecurity. We started talking about um, what needs to happen as a result of feeling insecure, right? So where did that come from? In this particular case, we could track it down and trace it back to certain interactions with his family growing up. That's not necessarily always the case. That's not necessarily a bad place to start. And so one for him, um, we discovered that he really didn't feel like there were times where he lived up to his father's expectations of him. So he kind of took those expectations for himself. But there's a different context of living up to a dad's expectations when you're 10 and now he's 35 um, and you're talking about uh, you know feeling insecure when you're 35 is different than when you're 8 or 10. So what we did was say, hey, what's the difference, right? What's the difference now when you're feeling this way versus what was the difference then? So giving a context to the actual emotion really does help people. Um, the data part's important because it tells us something. In this case, it was telling him he was feeling insecure, and he almost literally went right back to interactions with his dad. And he didn't have bad interactions with his dad all the time. It wasn't like an abusive situation, or wasn't even like always bad or anything. But there was just this instant, like he felt like his father was telling him something he was bad at or something like that. But we fast forwarded into the present and said, well, do you feel like your supervisor had that type of intent? We just kind of I asked him questions like that. And he was able to just kind of start wrapping his head around that maybe something was different, or there were some other things that were going on. And so that would be one example. I mean, it kind of depends on the situation with how we help people. Um, some people, when you tell them, hey, this is the emotion that you're feeling is data, it's giving you information. It doesn't have to, it's not a directive. It's not telling you to do something. It might feel like it. Sometimes that alone helps people like clear things in their mind. But then other times that really is hard for them because they've lived so long letting the emotion be the directive in their life. That takes a little bit more patience and time to kind of work through. Um, so does that, Ryan, does that help? I feel like I'm getting, I don't want to get too far off topic.
No, that was great. Thank you. No, I took a lot of notes. Thanks.
Okay, good. Oh my gosh, Jody, I just opened up the chat here. Is Jody still, she left, didn't she? Okay. I hope her mom's okay. Okay. Um, okay. Any other questions about anything that we're talking about right now?
How could that be something more that you explain, like, to a child? Like, that's how they're feeling. Like, I have a student in my class that he says, "Well, I have anger I I have anger issues, so this is why I act that," when he's in that moment, those are kinda some of the responses that he says.
Mm.
So how do you kinda describe what you were just talking about? Like, I'm sure that was with an older client.
Yeah, it was with an adult. How old is the kid?
He's in 2nd grade, so, like, 8.
8. What do you usually do?
I usually kinda just give him some time to sit there and kind of calm down because he gets this face, like, where I could tell he's not there, like, his owl has left, and he's not there in the moment, and so I kinda just give him some time to cool down, and then we talk about, like, how he was feeling and why he was feeling that way, or, um, when he's ready, like, I'll talk about like, the other day, it was something simple, like, he had said something inappropriate the day before, and then the next day he said it again. Well, another student was like, "He said this," and so I just said, "Hey, if you said that's inappropriate, please don't say that again." And that just sent him into a whole like meltdown. It wasn't like I wasn't, my tone stayed the same. It wasn't like we were having a whole conversation. He just shut down, started throwing a tantrum. And, that's when stuff like that will trigger him to, well, I have anger issues and, stuff like that. So I usually just try to let him calm down until he's ready to listen and talk it out. And so then I'll say, hey, like, do you think that that response is appropriate? Like all I was saying was this, and then we'll just kind of talk back and forth about it. He was like, oh yeah, that, like I don't make him feel like his feelings are invalid because like you said, there's a reason why he's acting that way. But like I said, I just try to kind of talk it through with him and just ask him why like he was feeling that way.
How was it? How would an 8-year-old know be able to tell you they have anger issues? That seems. like a pretty high level of skill for an 8-year-old?
Um, I honestly feel like he's been told that at some point, like, he's heard it somewhere, like, he might feel that he's upset, but I feel like more it's come from somebody telling him, "Well, this is why you act this way is because you have anger issues," and so, honestly feel like it's probably more of a, um, like, he's heard it, so I'm saying it, like, maybe he doesn't really understand what that means, but or maybe he's been told what that means, and so he uses that as a crutch. But, like, to how do I get him to, like I don't wanna say, "Well, that's wrong," and, I mean, he does have sometimes I mean, it's often where we're having tantrums and, having removals and stuff. I just I don't know how to kinda work through that.
Yeah. Um,
I will say he has made a lot of progress this year, but I
well,
just
probably because you're helping him. You might not know it, but that's what you're doing.
Mhm,
So there's a couple of things we can think about with emotions, especially. So we validate emotions. We don't have to validate behavior, right? We don't, but don't flip flop those, right? Like don't validate behavior and not validate the emotion. So validation means seeing it, you know, calling it out, like, hey, it seems like you're upset right now, or seems like you're angry right now, or seems like something's unfair. That seems really unfair, kind of thing. And in this case, with what you're describing to me is like it's smart to wait until he is calmed down and go back and talk to him. It's easier to have that conversation when they're calmed down. It's very difficult for children to have conversations when they're emotionally escalated. Kind of like it's hard for adults to have conversations when they're most emotionally escalated as well. Um, there's another thing you can think about with kids, and this works with teens too, to a certain extent, except they get wise to it and they probably might not like it as much. Um, if you can do externalizing conversations with kids, especially like, oh, well, I had a supervisor that his son had dyslexia, and they found out, I think he was in third or fourth grade or something like that. And the supervisor that I worked with at the time was pretty much almost like a narrative therapist. And so in narrative therapy, you do a lot of externalization exercises where you basically bring what's on the inside outside and you sit it up and you look at it. They'll even talk about like taking it out and sitting it on a chair and describe it. What does it look like? And what does it do? Or what does it don't do? That kind of thing. What kind of relationship do you have with it? So you do externalizing things. And his son actually came up with this and they just said, he said, I've got the dumb bug right now. Not like him being dumb, but this bug is dumb, this dumb bug. And so they used that for situations where his son was struggling with trying to read something or comprehend something. So the family kind of knew it was the dumb bug. What was only a part of him, right, that was feeling that way. It wasn't his whole self. But that externalization got it out of his head and then kind of set it over here to the side and they could look at it and know that's what's happening. You can do similar things with anger. Like that movie that came out a few years ago about the different emotions. Of course, I can't remember what it's called now. I see all the picture of them. Um, I can't remember what it's called, but that's a great
Inside
example.
Out.
Inside Out. That's a great example of externalization. Literally, that whole movie is an example of externalizing something so that you can see it. That's literally what it is. So with kids, if you can figure those things out and help them externalize what they're feeling, that really does help a lot because then they're not anger, right? Like this kid's not anger. He is angry, right? I don't have an anger problem. I get angry sometimes. What makes you angry? Well, when someone says this, or or this happens to me, or maybe I get embarrassed when something, what it could be multiple things um, that are going on, and in that age, especially between 8 and 12, there's a lot of emotional discovery that's happening, especially in social situations where there's a potential that um, they could be struggling. They're starting to struggle with like you know what other people think as well, which really is like really, really intense as you get into adolescence. But um, I don't know that with an 8-year-old or a 10-year-old, I'd be like, hey, that's just data. That's not a directive. Obviously, you're not going to do that. It sounds to me like a couple of the things you just described are very helpful for him. At the same time, it's not like we can be like totally get rid of anyone's angry responses because eventually it's up to the person to be in charge of that, right? Which is really what emotions are data and not directives. That's really what that means. I feel an emotion. It doesn't give me any excuse to just yell at someone or throw something or, when we feel angry, what's another alternative? What are other things that we can do or say? What are some of the other things that we can do instead of that instead of yelling and screaming? We don't shut the emotion down because if we shut the emotion down, all we're doing is teaching anyone to internalize it and not to let it out. Now, having said that, is it appropriate to let all emotions out all the time? Probably not. Obviously, there's certain situations where it's not great. Doesn't mean you never let it out. It just means we need to figure out what those situations are, which is part of the learning process, especially for kids. That's just part of how human beings learn. And and unfortunately, we learn best when we make mistakes. And so, um, I don't know. I have no idea if this is helpful, but those are just things that are kind of popping into my head as we're kind of talking through this. But it sounds to me like how you're handling it is you're doing a really good job. Sounds to me. I mean, that's what I would say. Th-
He has made a lot of growth. It's just really hard, um, in being in that situation and not being able to, like, not I feel like it's like another it I feel like it's triggered by something else, like, with a parent not being in the picture, and then I just feel like that just kind of it's, like, always on his mind, and so that's what kinda makes it hard, and then he I guess, starts thinking about it or it's just always in his, like, I guess, in the unconscious, but he's, like, thinking about it. He's not doesn't realize he's thinking about it, and then he just has built up feelings about something, and it just comes out when in class, he gets upset by something. I don't wanna minimize it by, but, like, something small turns into something big, if that makes sense. So, we've
yeah,
been
sure.
working through it. I just didn't know if there was another strategy I could use or something, or if there was a different way to approach that with kids. But you did a good job, thank you.
Well, it's hard to do in a classroom anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah. So some of the problem with emotions when we talk about kids or teenagers is the adults have a problem with their emotions. So we need to get better at feeling okay about them having emotions, especially if they're especially if they're expressing them outwardly. That makes it really difficult. So, um, but yeah, that's a good question. I want to transition to something. I'm gonna put everyone in breakout rooms. Got 13 people. So I'm gonna put everyone in breakout rooms. This is gonna be we're gonna transition now into our discussion about adolescence. And so what I'd like to do is this is fairly simple, be pretty straightforward. In your rooms, I just kind of want you to talk about your favorite experience in junior high or high school, either one, and if and your least favorite experience. And I ask for both because we typically do have both most of the time. I just want you to kind of talk about it, and then if we have, I'm going to give you guys a few minutes to do that. Um, Sometimes what I find when I ask this particular question with the groups, when I put people in groups, sometimes we end up talking about like the differences in when you grew up and versus now, which is fine. That's fine. That inevitably happens with most of these discussions, um, which I think is okay for you guys to talk about. I just want you also to be able to express like, hey, here's my favorite, experience, and here's my least favorite experience um, in in your teen, like either junior high or high school or both, either one. Like for me, my least favorite experience was, um, a really difficult breakup. I think I was a sophomore. I dated this person for a few months, and then school started, and we were together, and then all of a sudden we weren't. And at 15, it was, as a boy, it was very confusing because it seemed all of a sudden. And I can remember the feeling, like the really sick feeling, like I felt at that point, and that kind of stopped me from dating for a long time. But I also had a really good experience in high school where I met and kind of started hanging out with the guy that ended up being one of my best friends in the world. And we actually became debate partners, and we were in cross sex debate for 3 years, and those experiences were awesome. So I'd like for you guys to kind of talk through those two things. And if you find yourself comparing, your experience to today's experience, we're actually going to talk about that too. So I'm going to give you a few minutes to do that, and then we will come back together. And you should get that popping up in your screen, and just join that, and I will see you in a few minutes. one of the things that I try to talk about when we kind of look at the adolescent world is there have been a lot of change to our world in the last 30 years, especially the last 15 years. There hasn't been a ton of change in how adolescents actually develop. There's the developmental process is pretty similar to the way it's always been, but our world has changed. Like the world that we live in has changed in lots of ways. And so I say that because um, I kind of want us to be able to keep the main thing the main thing. We're talking about how human beings develop, not necessarily like how our world is developing. We're talking about like how we develop inside that world. And obviously the world's changing. It's going to change. It's going to continue to change. So in my mind, this helps. I guess this helps me try to stay focused and realize that yes, there are lots of things outside of my control and outside of my scope of control. Yet there's things that I still know that are still true. Puberty is a truth. It's still happening. Now it's happening at different times than it used to, different ages, but it's still happening. And it's still a crazy process. Our brain begins to form connections between the left and right hemispheres as we get into adolescence. That's still happening. Um, we begin to form our identity, like really start thinking through identity. That whole process is still happening. So those are just some examples. Like those are still happening. And so for me, that allows me to just kind of be like, okay, feel out of control about some things, but I know these things are true. Like I know this is actually happening. Like these things are going on. And so that helps me, I think, kind of keep my head steady. And especially clinically speaking, um, it's super important for us to remember, like, if you end up working with teenagers, whether you're a teacher, school counselor, LPC, LMFT, whatever you end up doing, but you end up working with teenagers, keeping in mind that they're not adults. They're every one of them are in a process at the moment. We might not like the process, but they're in a process. That's very important. The hard part about that is we don't treat them like children either. They're in between, right? They're in between the childhood and the adult world. They're in between. They want to be adults. They want to, you know, act that way and be that way and have those benefits of adulthood, but they're not adults yet. Um, Case in point, Taylor's album, Why She Does This, I Don't Know, was going to come out on a Thursday night at midnight. So what does my daughter want to do? On a school night, in the middle of band marching season, she wants to stay up till midnight, which means really 2 o'clock because she'll listen to the album. She'll be online with friends. Like, so we had to say, I don't think this is a good idea. Well, then what's that mean? Well, why not? Right. The whole conversation. So we have always taken the approach with our kids, especially as they gotten older, just being kind of like really direct about, hey, Park, when you're up a lot and you don't get a lot of sleep, you tend to be kind of cranky, and then you're cranky with your friends, and then you have a hard time, and that's what we're worried about. And she went from like, wow, what's the deal, to kind of being upset about that, to finally like 10 minutes later going, okay, that's probably right, because that's how she is. She needs a lot of sleep. She needs she needs to sleep. Um, so we kind of made a compromise and kind of got in the middle. But that's a different conversation that we would have with our teen kids than with our little kids. When we talk about childhood, it's more like, hey, this is what we're doing. You need to get some sleep because we had a long day tomorrow. As kids get older, you can have different conversations with them. You can have a conversation that's more kind of like, hey, here's what I think. What do you think? You still can make the decision, but you're getting more input with them and you're talking with them more and you're being more open about it. And so I credit my wife for that. She's really good at kind of like being very open and, hey, here's what's happening. And what we said would happen happened. later that day on Friday. She had a really hard time with one of her friends who's being really kind of wishy-washy. And so, but that's the world that they live in. And so they want to be adults, but they're still not adults, but they're not kids. So they're in the in between kind of place. Okay. I am going to give the warning to everyone that this particular topic causes me to get off on lots of rabbit trails. That's why I have PowerPoint slides that try to keep me focused, but I'm just giving you a heads up. I apologize in advance to all my super type A folks that are really like the notes, and when I get off on tangents, keep taking notes even though I'm on a tangent. I apologize in advance. But those of you that like stories, this is gonna be awesome. You're gonna love it. It's gonna be great. And so some stuff we've just talked about, I'm gonna bring up some things specifically too as we go through. And at this particular time, I am going to take periodic breaks to ask if anyone has questions. But if I say something or go through something here and you have a question right then, just jump on and say. I don't mind that at all. I think that's fine. The 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 face of adolescence, um, both their physical appearance, their cognitive functioning, their emotional functioning, all are changing and going through tons of different developmental tasks. This is the second most active any human being's brain is, other than infancy, ever. They're very, very active right now, neurologically. There are some heavy influences on the adolescent world. Um, I wrote two things really. Culture is the umbrella, ethnicity, gender, different ages, geography, family setup. Those are all influences, and that would probably all kind of function under cultural influences. Socioeconomic status also is a huge influence in this area, in this world. And so we're going to talk about some of these as we go through, but these are just some of the big influences. We haven't talked at all yet about anything about screen time or social media or anything like that, but those are also would fall under culture. Like the use of social media would also be, which is probably the newest of those influences in the last 10 years or 12 years. The iPhone's 15 years old, so I kind of say 2007 is like to me the big changing of the tide with the iPhone, because then all of a sudden you've got the world literally at your fingertips. And so that was a big change. So in the last 15 years, there's been tons of change in that world too. And again, the rabbit trail is going to happen at the end. I can't stop it. It's just going to happen. We're going to talk about social media towards the end, which I used to not talk about very much, but now we have to, because it's part of your clinical practice. Gender, socioeconomic, I talked about all these. One of the things that we know for sure, and this is bared out in many different types of research studies, dating back to even like in the early 2000s, teenagers benefit from having caring adults in their lives other than just their parents or guardians, right? They really benefit from it, even though they act like they don't want that. There's a large benefit they get from having now we're talking about a couple of things: adults that care about them and that they trust and respect, and their parents or guardians or caregivers can trust and respect too, not just some random adult person, but people in their lives that they really benefit from having that type of person in their life. There's a couple of big benefits. I don't know if I put them. A couple of the big benefits, that one of them is having another voice in their world that can be kind of that level-headed voice for them, that can listen, and reflect to them and kind of be there with them. The other part of it is the fact that if they can have that kind of a relationship with another adult outside their family, if they can have that kind of good, caring adult relationship, they can learn how to do that for later in life, and they actually have that for later in life. It's not just something that they need when they're teenagers. It's actually something that can be beneficial as they get older as well. Okay. I mentioned puberty. Puberty is a um, sexual revolution that happens to every human being. Um, the age of puberty, the beginning of puberty is different for guys and girls, and the ages for girls especially have been getting earlier and earlier over time. Um, there's some biological things that happen that unfortunately also play into some really difficult thought patterns, especially for girls early, like younger girls, like in junior high, late elementary and junior high, because you have weight gain and height gain and um, like your feet grow, your guys start getting facial hair, they start getting pubic hair, um, girls' breasts start growing, guys begin to have different voices. So there's some things that happen that are happening, like you directly see it or hear it. And unfortunately, it happens at like this super awkward time where also it's happening to everyone else. And if everyone else is awkward, then what are they going to do? They're going to make fun of each other, or they're going to say things that are mean, or, that kind of thing, especially in groups. And the worst thing that you can do to a girl that's having trouble as she's putting on weight for maybe the first time in her whole life is say something, hey, it looks like you put on weight, or whatever you want to fill that blank with, right? Um, For guys, it's more kind of like if they don't get taller, it's tough for them, or don't get muscular, let's say, versus other guys, that's tough for them. So there's some really awkward things that are happening. I have a really good friend that uh, she said this when my kids were going into junior high a few years ago. She's like, I feel like junior high is just something you survive as a parent because it's so awkward and difficult and frustrating, and it doesn't have to be all horrible, but there's just so many awkward things about it. And it's really awkward for the kids. It's awkward for parents too. But because of all these things that are happening with them, and they're happening really quickly, that sometimes you just want to survive, junior high to get to high school. And it's just as difficult in high school. But those beginning early years of puberty are very tough. They're really tough if the kids have never had the conversation about like what's about to happen or what is happening, right, with their bodies or their mind, that kind of thing. I talked about the sequence of puberty beginning. So it's now this is even old. This is like 9 years, almost 10 years old now. I don't know if the book might. I feel like this is still pretty accurate. Trying to think if I've seen anything different. So it's not uncommon for a 9-year-old or 10-year-old girl to start puberty. That happens, even up to 15 years, which is a little bit late. For boys between 10 and 13 and a half or 14 is pretty normal now. Those ages have changed over time, for sure. Over the decades, those ages have changed. Um, and depending on when it starts, depending on when puberty starts, um, you might have to have really difficult conversations with kids because of that. Whenever, clinically speaking, if I have a parent that's brought a kid, it's typically a boy. Usually, it's not as much now, but if they are bringing them in because they're having, they've gotten in trouble with something or whatever, or they found pornography on their computer or something like that. I typically also ask the parents, like, what do they know about sex? Like, have you talked to them about what it is and not? When did you have the puberty talk? When did you talk about sex? I ask questions like that so I can understand what the kids know or don't know from the parents, because obviously they know things from their friends. And so those are things to kind of think about clinically. And there are now a lot, some pretty good resources out there to help parents talk through some of those things with their kids. Um, and so, and we're going to talk about sex here in a little bit, but I talked about neurological changes. The connecting fibers between the left and right hemispheres really start to connect with each other during adolescence. The amygdala, which is kind of where the seat of emotions sit, so that's the kind of the beginning of the limbic system, is really super active. You can have high highs and low lows. Um, the prefrontal cortex, unfortunately, that we really need with those high highs and low lows, is not super active yet. It's not fully online. It's still there, but the idea of, like, in reasoning or decision making or self control, like last night, we're at a football game and we were unfortunately sitting right beside the student section, and they kept doing something in the middle of their group, like throwing water or something, not realizing that it affected everyone else around them. But that's because they're not thinking about that. Your prefrontal cortex helps you go, I don't, is this a good idea? Like, should I do this? And if you say to yourself, I don't think this is a good idea, it actually stops the impulse from taking over. So it's like double whammy. If it's not online, it's not fully online until you're about 25. The other thing that's happening is, especially when we get into the high school years, you have this dendritic pruning, which the book does a great job of talking about. I mean, the video that I mentioned earlier, she does a really good job of talking about this as well. That's where you get some personality change, and it seems like they're a little bit crazy. Like, it seems like they're just changing right in front of you, and you don't know what's happening. And I've had many parents say, "I don't know who this is." I hear this all the time. They used to be fill in the blank, but now it's because there's some pruning in their brain going on. There's some things that they're that are happen. There's things that are happening to them neurologically, that they're deciding on things like, hey, I used to like this thing or activity. Maybe I don't like it now. Maybe I like this thing. That's one of the things that's happening. I used to hang out with these people. Now I hang out with these people. I liked this idea, but I don't know if I like it anymore. I like this idea. All of those things are happening. And it's literally them trying to kind of figure out who they are and what they believe and what they like. And that's the beginning stages of it. And that's why it appears so out of control. Because also adults in their world have already kind of gone through that. And as adults in their world, we have a little bit of a hardship because we know things that they don't know, because we've had experiences they haven't had. But it's really difficult to tell them that without them becoming defensive. Hence, a parent could tell a kid, their teenage son or daughter, the same thing a million times. But Audra could be a good friend to that kid and tell them the exact same thing. And Audra is the most brilliant person that's ever walked the earth. Mom or dad said the exact same thing. Mom, dad, grandparents, whoever. But if that good friend, that good adult friend says that thing, man, it's like, oh my gosh, how did I never think of this? I never heard this before. So that's one of the things that's very important to remember. They're not listening. They just need other influences in their life. Now, it helps that those other influences align with what you feel like is appropriate for them. That helps too. Let's talk about sex. These are old. These are still pretty accurate. Um, so this is timing of first intercourse by age. So it starts at 15. It goes up to 19. It's about three quarters of boys and girls by 19 have had their first intercourse. That number is pretty steady. And I don't think I have some of these, and some of the stats I know I don't have in terms of like pregnancies and things. We track them, but not as closely. Like pregnancy rates have been going down since the 90s. Um, Sexual intercourse rates haven't necessarily gone down. Uh, Other sexual activities haven't necessarily gone down either, um, which means, which kind of makes sense because this is a time of experimentation as well. And so when we think about sex, there's a couple of things to think about. And this, no, I want to talk about this clinically real quick. So, clinically speaking, what the research tells us about, like, even talking to kids about sex and how we talk to them about sex really does matter. Um, One thing that I think, at least I have experienced this clinically with parents, is that sometimes either, let's say, I don't know about you guys. I'm assuming that there's probably more than a handful of folks that maybe your parents didn't talk to you about sex really that much at all, other than don't do it. But there was really not a discussion about it. Um, my mom's a nurse, and I had very specific conversations about it with her, and she got one of her books out, and we talked about it, which was super embarrassing as a 13-year-old. But as I got older, I actually appreciated it because she was very open about it. The more open you can be, and the more discussions you can have with kids, we know that they do less experimentation. So it's a very interesting correlation. The more conversation you have, the less experimentation. Doesn't mean no experimentation. It doesn't mean less feelings of sexual urge or daydreaming about sex or dreaming about it or feeling sexual awakening. It doesn't mean that that doesn't happen, because those are all perfectly normal parts of the process. But there's a myth that kind of was going around for a long time, and probably still is in some areas, that if we talk about sex, they're going to want to do it more. And that's actually not true. The more we can talk about it, the less they're going to be likely to do it. And some of that's because you're dispelling a lot of the curiosities about it. Okay, it doesn't mean there's no sex. All of a sudden, we talk to our kids and no one's having sex or whatever. Um, that's not what that means. It just means we have to have open conversations about it. It really does help them. Now, one thing that we can do as clinicians is we can give or provide parents with, resources in terms of like how to talk to them about it, what to say or not say. Should I like, this is questions I get from parents. Should I talk about my sexual history or even alcohol or usage and that kind of thing? Should I bring those things up? So all of those are questions that would be normal, when we start thinking about it. But we want to be mindful that, uh, whether we talk about sex or not, they're still thinking about it. They're still going through the experience of puberty, which is literally like a sexual awakening. Not like, it is a sexual awakening. So it's happening anyway. We might as well talk about it. When I say talk about it, that usually means more than once. It means periodically. Okay. All right. Let me take a step back. Anybody have any questions about anything I'm talking about so far?
I have a question. Um, so you're talking about talking periodically about sex with your teens and whatnot, but how long do you think that those conversations have to continue, like into early adulthood, or?
I mean, I think it probably depends on the situation. I'm sure, like, if there's, you know, it's kind of like any other, behavior, uh, that you want them to be mindful of. Like if they're dating someone, maybe you might want to have discussions about it. Uh, I I think the point is that for a long time, talking about sex was taboo for a lot of people. so it just didn't happen. And you can flip flop to the other side where it's like all you talk about too. That's not healthy either. Trying to find that balance in the middle, because there's going to be, especially at the beginnings of puberty, like the first year or so, 2 3 years of puberty, like there's going to be changes that are happening that if you have open conversations about with them can be helpful for them, just so they feel like they're not weird or something weird's not happening. um uh I think that the more you're able to connect with them and be open and non-judgmental with them, uh the they're also likely to actually come and talk to you about things. The non-judgmental part is the hardest part. That's the hardest part, I would say. So I would say by the time they get into college, you're not even you if you're having a talk about sex, it's probably very different than when they're 14 anyway. Uh, and so you might not have as many conversations as they get into the college years, especially. Um, I think there was a time in our history where talking about sex meant you talked to someone about sex on their wedding night. That was kind of how it was done because that's just how it was done. And then all of a sudden was like, hey, don't do it. As we fast forward through time, it's kind of like, don't do it. It's evil. Um, don't do that ever, kind of thing, or it's only when you get married. and and those messages are still there for people and in families, and it's up to your family how you want to do it. I'm just saying the research tells us the more we are open to having discussions about it, especially allowing them to ask questions, um, the less experimentation happens. And so I don't know if that answers your question, but I
No,
think it's a
yeah.
good question. um, Yeah, I don't know if there's like, hey, do it 5 times and that's enough, but I think you have to kind of know what the situation is, probably.
Yeah. Thank you.
Any other questions about anything we're talking about? All right, let's talk about substance abuse, substance use and abuse. So we have in America one of the highest rates of adolescent drug use in the industrialized world. And uh, where we've had declines in alcohol and cigarette consumption, not zero consumption, but declines in recent years. Now, cigarettes has really been replaced by vaping, and alcohol usage is still happening, but we have more usage of other drugs, whether they're recreational or over the counter. That's happening. One of the reasons why that's really, really potentially damaging is there's some neurological reasons. Uh, we have a interesting thing that happens in our brain, in that the way our brain is developed and designed, it is basically a reward center, where when we get a hit of dopamine, for example, it's a reward for something. It's a very pleasurable experience, and so dopamine rushes in, and we feel good, and we like that. Glutamate, which is a key memory making neurotransmitter, comes in, locks in that experience for later. And then we go, hey, I want to feel that thing again. I want to feel that feel good again. So we do the same behavior. In the case of substances, alcohol or substance use, whether it's marijuana or alcohol or meth or heroin, obviously they have different levels of um, uh, effects for sure, but they all kind of turn those reward centers on, and the reward centers literally like right in the middle of our brain, like deep inside in the middle of our brain. It's the part of our brain mostly known as the reptilian part, which is that fight or flight, Um, Also, the reward part of our brain, it just keeps coming on time after time after time, and that's how you develop uh, abusive or addictive behavior. Because what it does is overpower the stop system, which is our prefrontal, which is not strong enough to stop that powerful um, part of our brain. We lose impulse control because of that, and we just start, and then we'll form a habit. I mean, there's lots of things that happen. So, uh, education is very important when it comes to um, substances and alcohol. Except some of the problems that we've had in the past are some education programs haven't been awesome and haven't always helped, because there's almost no education program that's more powerful than our reward system. The reward system is very powerful in our brains. And so when we get hooked on something, it can be, depending on what it is, especially, can be really hard to get off of that hook. Um, the interesting thing about that is that, sugar will will light up the same parts of the brain that methamphetamine lights up. Obviously, different effects. I'm not comparing sugar and methamphetamine. I'm saying the brain sees them very similarly. That's all. Which, if you've ever tried to give up sweets, or if you've been trying to give up sweets during the holiday season, like during Halloween, you realize how hard it is, because you have a impulse to consume, which is really means you don't need that. You don't need to have it, but you want to have the experience of feeling that need being met. So does that make sense to everyone? You have any question about that? I'm gonna slow down here for a second.
Dr. DeBard, I currently work with uh, people that struggle with substance abuse right now, and most of them started during their adolescent years. And you can tell that their brain has not developed as much as someone that has not used substance abuse
Hmm.
due to the reward system that you were just talking about, being dependent on it
Yep.
and not knowing how to identify emotions.
Hmm.
Um, Emotions, you ask them how they're doing today, and they're not able to identify, or let alone want to identify, because um, they're fighting with the impulse to leave treatment to go use.
Oh yeah. And depending on what their drug of choice was, um, heroin and methamphetamine are pretty powerful
Yes.
drugs for sure. Just like opioids,
Mm-hmm.
very powerful, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right. You bring up a really good point. And I think Ryan said this earlier about being arrested, like arrested development. Basically, emotionally speaking, when someone goes into an addiction, their emotional development does stall at that point.
Mm-hmm.
That's why sometimes, I'm sure you see this with folks you work with, they might be 40, but they come across emotionally like they're 15 sometimes,
Yes, sir.
or 18 or something like
Mm-hmm.
that, because their emotions, now they can catch up. That the development can catch up, but there is a delay there, and some of that's because of what's happening to their brain at the time. Their reward system is so powerful, it's basically in charge,
Mm-hmm.
like it takes over. And the
Mm-hmm.
reason why they want to use is probably their brain's basically telling them, if I don't use, I might die. It's
Mm-hmm.
how powerful it is.
Right. So that explains the withdrawals. Just by
Oh yeah,
them going through withdrawals, they immediately think, I need this,
I gotta have it.
I need this drug of choice
Mhm.
just so I feel better. We're getting a lot of teens, like 18, 19,
Mhm.
early teens, coming in using fentanyl. So
Oh yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Fentanyl is extremely dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and the other thing that here's one of the things that happens with, like, building a tolerance, and this is true of any kind of substance, even legal medications. When we all have it's called a hedonic set point. It's all everyone has a kind of a normal pleasure threshold. When I say pleasure, I mean like things that feel good, like you want to repeat. Everyone has a like a normal threshold. As you use substances or alcohol, you become more tolerant of that, and your threshold starts to rise. So if your threshold was down here and this was your normal, and you used and you got high or you kind of got drunk, if over time that threshold starts rising, which means you have to use more just to feel normal, which means you have to use more just to feel the high, right? So as the higher that threshold goes, the more you have to use to feel normal. That's one of the reasons why, like when someone's detoxing, first of all, there's physical harm that can happen through detoxing, but there's also neurological things that are happening when you're detoxing. They're detoxing from here, and all of a sudden you're wanting them to go down here, and that's a big gap. And that's why the detox is so difficult. Is because they're trying to come down off something, and it takes time for that to happen. It could take 18 to 24 months like for alcohol, for example. 18 to 24 months is fairly normal for an alcoholic brain to all of a sudden kind of be back online and out of a fog. Like you'll hear sometimes people talk about a fog or a haze. Depending on how long they used, it could take up to 2 years for their brain to be clear. It doesn't mean that they can't. It doesn't mean that they're not in recovery or can't do it. It just means it's harder, especially as those impulses and urges are around. So when it starts in adolescence, it makes it really hard to end as they get older. The hard part again is that in adolescence is this strong urge to experiment to begin with. And that's one of the things that's difficult about it. Um, and so having said that, these areas of the adolescent world, are pretty niche areas. Like if you wanted to work in treatment facilities that work with, teens or maybe even folks in their 20s, those are no, that's a pretty big niche right now with people. And a lot of those clinics have to have some type of medical assistance because when you're detoxing off something like alcohol, if you're detoxing from alcohol, for example, I mean, you could have a stroke. Parts of your different organs can shut down. Same thing with heroin. You have to be really careful when people start going through detox. If you're detoxing from other things, maybe not as difficult, but heroin is any of the depressants are pretty difficult, actually. Okay, there's a couple of things. I want to talk about. This I'm going to talk about abstract thinking in relation to religious and spiritual development. Um, and there's quite a bit of research on religious development, spiritual development, which religious development used to mean religious teaching. Spiritual development now means more spiritual formation. So there's a little bit of difference there. So there's a learning aspect, and then there's also this formation aspect, which is more about the discipline of your spirituality. Um, we know that because their brains are going from black and white thinking to abstract thinking, that does have an effect on some belief systems that they might have or had as they grow up. One of the things that happens is, especially starting in adolescence and kind of into our 20s, is we like in terms of spirituality and religious belief, we're a lot of times trying to figure out if we believe those things or if we align with those ideas or those principles or those religious thoughts or those spiritual practices. We're trying to figure that out for ourselves, and which is actually not a bad thing. It's something that helps us actually decide what we do believe. And so the increased abstract thinking lets adolescents kind of consider various ideas about different concepts, which unfortunately in the adult world seems really scary because we're talking about things that appear to be black and white. But if you've already gone through that process yourself and get to the other side where you kind of know where your beliefs are, and then a group of teens say, I don't know if I believe that or this, it can be very difficult to experience that. And so I had that experience as a youth pastor for a long time, just having, um, kids say things and struggle with things that maybe they weren't talking to their parents about for various reasons. Um, but it's actually a pretty normal process. Uh, we do also know that the role of religion is a very positive force in adolescent life. Um, it can also be very positive for them later in life as well. And so there's actually a little bit written on like like religious development itself, in terms of like when kids are little, they mimic things that parents do, and then they mirror as they get older. They mirror things that parents do when we're talking about religious practices, especially. They mirror those things, and then they'll eventually either decide to take them on or change them or do something different as they get older. So that's just kind of part of development. Um, there's been um, in I'll say in the religious world, and this is not just the Christian religion, but other religious systems. There's been tons of research now done on you know uh, things like denominational loyalty, let's say, has changed over the last 30 years. Like where someone growing up in a certain denomination, let's say, maybe aren't loyal to that denomination anymore, and maybe they try other denominations or other thought, religious belief areas. That's one of the things. Maybe kids that were super active, let's say in a youth group going through, even through high school, and they get to college and then they're not active at all. That's been happening for a while. There's been a ton of research on things like that. Um, I think that probably there's 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 probably some reasons, but I don't think it's I don't think there's one reason why. I don't think there's one thing that's happening. There's probably multiple things that's happening. And there's probably some cultural things. There's probably a little bit of, you know, there's some abstract thinking that's happening. There's probably multiple things that are happening, but there's also a fair amount of adolescents that also continue to keep, experience, and practice different religious thought. There's also a fair amount of kids that do that too. So it's not just everyone's leaving and everything's horrible. It's not necessarily like that. Um, One of the things that's also been happening um, in terms of religious and spiritual development is as people get into their late 20s and get married and then have kids, there's a tendency to come back to the things that they learned and were involved in as teenagers. So that's an interesting. Those are some interesting things. This particular topic we could probably spend a lot of time talking about, because this is definitely something that is like the religious development itself is very fascinating because there's lifespan development happening and religious development happening on top of that, which is kind of interesting to look at. All right, I'm gonna skip ahead. Sorry, I'm looking for a couple of things. I want to talk about um, technology, but let me take a step back. Anybody have questions about anything we've talked about so far? I don't mean to go so fast. I want to make sure we can have plenty of time to ask questions. Okay. I'm again trying to pull out certain things from the massive amount of reading that you guys are doing on this topic. This particular topic, adolescent development, we could definitely spend 10 weeks on easily. We're going to spend one day. Now you're going to read more about it. Um, I do want to talk a little bit about social media and screen usage uh, in terms of like talk about it clinically real quick. There's a couple of things that have happened in the past 5 years, like the World Health Organization has now talked about a gaming addiction, and there's actually a gaming addiction assessment that's out now. And so, video game addiction is not talked about as much in America as like it is the rest of the world, but that's going to change, I think. It's going to be similar types of addictive behavior as you would find in like uh, any kind of process addiction like gambling or people have shoplifting addiction, that kind of thing. It's very similar to that. There's a little bit of there's starting to be a little more research on, what does screen time do or not do to us neurologically? How does it affect us? How does it not affect us? And so I want to talk kind of broadly about some of that research and some of that, some of the effect. Uh, and I'm going to talk about it from the standpoint of like what the idea behind the providers of social media, the companies that provide the services, the Facebooks, the Snapchats, the TikTok, the um, Instagram, uh, Twitter, I'll say Snapchat, all of those. Their their basic premise um, is not like, hey, we're all in this together, getting along, and everything's awesome. Their whole premise is to make money, and so that's what they try to do. And the way that they make money is keep people engaged in their platform. And the way that you keep people engaged in the platform is very similar to the way that you keep people engaged with, smoking a cigarette or eating a Snickers. You make the experience as pleasurable as you can, and you get those little hits of dopamine as much as you can. The same can be said of like anything you see on your phone, like any news sites or news apps or YouTube app. I mean, anything like they're trying to keep people around, because the more they keep you around, the more advertising you can see, and the more they can gather information about you and get and steer you towards content that you like or that you would resonate with. And so that's the whole premise of those providers. That's what they're trying to do. Now, I'm not anti, TikTok and anti gaming. I'm not anti anything. I think those things are fine. I use them too. I think they're fine to use. I think they can be helpful to use. Sometimes I think they're great things to just kind of laugh at. I mean, there's some really funny videos out there now that they're fun to watch and funny. At the same time, what's actually also happening is that they're very good at what they do, and they're very good at keeping us engaged, and they're very good at turning on that reward system. So much so that we lose track of time sometimes, or we lose track of, the fact that our impulse control pieces of our brain don't have a chance to kind of jump in and go, hey, we've been doing this for X amount of time. Maybe we don't need to do this right now, kind of deal. So the adolescent brain itself is very susceptible to that. And so there's got to be ways to have boundaries around that usage. And I would say one of the problems that we're having right now, this is clinically speaking, and this is just mostly observational because I don't have a ton of research to back this up. I'm just going off of observation from clients. Some of the issues that we're having with teenagers being on screens is because the adults are on screens a lot. So if the adults in their life are basically on their phone all the time, not all the time, but heavily engaged, or watching something, Netflix or whatever on the TV, that's what they're going to do too, because they're going to mirror and replicate that. They that's kind of what they do, and then they can get down their own rabbit holes and things. And so I think in some ways, uh, we for sure are not going back, right? We're not going back to like no more social media, no more screens. That's not happening. We're going to continue. Matter of fact, augmented reality is something that's on the rise. Um, um, Facebook itself, Meta, is heavily invested into the meta world, which is basically creating like the sim world idea. Um, Virtual reality systems, or I mean, these are all animate, AI. All these things are not going away. There's going to be more and more of them. I just bring this up so that we can become educated about it. And I think as clinicians, to me, this is just as we need to become just as educated about this as we do about substance and alcohol usage. It's not because we're anti-social media, and those are different than substance and alcohol use for sure. They're not the same. I'm not equating them. I'm saying there's similar impacts that we can have. You're going to have consequences if you spend most of your time on sites and you don't get off of them or you don't take breaks. Which in some ways, what's happening is it's turning on the reward system. It's also turning on depression. It's also turning on anxiety, and it's not allowing those things to come back down. I have actually, in working with clients, have actually suggested taking hiatus from certain things, whether it's a screen or a social media or whatever, and not forever, but just taking a hiatus because it allows your brain to kind of come back and realign. Um, the technology companies are smart. They learned a long time ago how to make their product the most effective they can, and so they started hiring behavioral psychologists a long time ago to help them design things that keep us behaviorally involved. And so we have to just know that, and we have to learn to make some changes and tweaks to that. And so I don't bring this up to bash anything. This in itself is a whole huge topic. I just think it's something that we need to be informed about and think about because it is having a large impact on our world right now. And so I wanted to bring that up and talk about that specifically because I think that's something that's definitely newish in the clinical world that I have been experiencing over the past few years. And I think it's important for us to kind of think about. Okay. Having said that, any questions about any of the things we talked about today? Because we're going to kind of head into kind of a question and answer section here of class. Any questions about anything we've been talking about? All right. Okay. Now, any questions at all about the class? Any class questions? Sometimes I get questions at this point about our paper that's coming up.
Yes, Dr. DeBard,
Yeah.
Dr. Bernard, I wanted to ask about, I have a question about the paper.
Yeah.
What is the paper supposed to be over?
Okay. Have you read the document on Moodle about it? Can you be more specific?
Okay, give me a moment.
And the reason why I'm asking that is sometimes people, I just want to make sure I understand what you're asking.
Okay. Okay, so we're picking a development stage, a stage of development from the book. So adolescence, I'll say, in whatever we are interested in researching on adolescence.
And then you're choosing a disorder or an issue that adolescents come in contact with.
Right.
And then you're going to also talk about treatment options that are available for whatever that issue is. And that's the research section. The second section is just the reflection section. It's just these 3 questions that I've got there. Why'd you pick it? Did your opinion about it change after researching it? Is there things you'd like to know more about? That kind of thing. So when we talk about adolescence, like adolescence obviously is large. So, maybe you say, hey, high school students, I want to know about, like in your world, like, fentanyl use with high school students or something like that,
Okay.
addiction or something. Probably the more specific you can be, the better. It just helps you with the research part.
So, okay.
Go ahead.
So like slimming it down to just a substance use, not just substance use in whole.
Yeah, I mean, however, for that particular topic, you should find tons of information. There's a lot of research into substance use in adolescence for sure. You
Right.
won't have any trouble. Just make sure that you can use the book as a resource. Sure. You just need to also have 3 other sources outside of the book, like articles, usually what most people use.
Okay.
That also, and that's where you would get a lot of your information too.
Okay.
Okay. Does that make
Okay.
sense?
Yes. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Dr. Bedard, I have a question. If you could recommend some additional reading on adolescent addiction, maybe more in like the nature versus nurture.
So, I mean, you can go on, like if you just wanted to read research articles about addiction in adolescence, that won't be hard to find. You could probably find a bunch. I'm not aware of like how nature versus nurture's like addressed specifically. Now there's probably some research done in terms of like genetic predispositions, maybe kind of thing. There's probably research in that along those lines, like epigenetic studies kind of stuff. Like for example, like we know things about like DNA markers that we all have, and some markers get turned on and some don't. Like some of those markers could be like an addictive kinds of areas or other mental health areas that get turned on because of environment most of the time. There are studies about things like that, and those are mostly like genetic type studies. I mean, honestly, if you went into like EBSCO, like on the Amberton's library site, if you wanted to EBSCO or even Google Scholar and just kind of typed in what you're just talking about, you potentially could get some hits on that. I'm just not aware of any that are done like specifically looking at nature and nurture. I think it's a great question.
Okay, thank you.
Does that help at all?
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. There's a really good book. I was looking for it and I can't find it. I think I have it in the other room. Called Brainstorm. I'll put this in the chat. It's a great book. See if I'm gonna put this in the chat real quick for you guys. This will have something to do with. It's written by Daniel Siegel. It's a powerful book. It's really good. It's well researched. Here, I'll stick it in there. The Power and Purpose of the Teenage Brain. Oh, it's got a paperback version now. Oh, awesome. Anyway, Daniel Siegel's does a great job of looking at the neuroscience of the brain. The title is great. Brainstorm is exactly what's going on. That would be a really good resource, I would think. I've only read the first chapter or two. I haven't even read through the whole thing. But it's really good, really well done. And I'm bringing that up, Amanda, because of your question. I haven't read this yet, but I'm thinking there's going to be information in terms of some of the things you're talking about in that book. I bet you anything. Any other questions?
Yeah, the paper's supposed to be 4 to 6 pages. My references ended up being on a 7th page. Is that an issue?
No, that's okay.
Okay.
Yeah, that's okay.
And then you're still working on grading the APA assignment and exercise 2, right?
I am. And I'll have exercise 2 I'll get done this weekend. The APA one, I'm just kind of taking my time to go through. Yeah, but I'm still working on it. I'm really behind on those for sure.
Okay, no problem. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Anybody have any answers?
I love that comment. No, you gave us a lot of really good information today. I really appreciate it. Thanks.
Good. Am I overloading you too much? Hopefully not.
No, the more the better, in my
Okay.
opinion.
Okay. Do you guys find these classes to be helpful for you?
Yes,
Very.
it solidifies what we've been reading about.
Okay.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. Good. Okay.
Absolutely, because you can read all day and still not know. I know for myself, I can read something like, what in the world are they talking about? So it's helpful to do the classes online.
Good. Good.
Kind of like nature and nurture. The combination of the two gives us the best result.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's probably a little bit of both. That's right. Okay. I can't think of anything else. That's it. Any other questions? Other than that, we can go do something else.
I have a question. You mentioned a video earlier. Is that
Mhm.
something on our own time? There's a video today that we're supposed to watch, or did I mishear you?
You don't have to watch it. I just put it up there for people to see. I think it's a sometimes I show it in the class and sometimes I don't. Hang on. Let me make sure I'm telling you the right thing. I think it's on.
It's on Moodle though.
Yeah. Yes. It's actually on the week 6. Yeah, with Sarah Jane Blakemore.
I guess I'm not seeing it, or I'm blind.
Let me share my screen.
Oh, it's. Oh.
Here's the.
Yeah, it helps if you get in the right class. Sorry.
It's okay. Hey, look at all these classes I have. Look at all this. So yeah. And Kara, sometimes we struggle with that. And I say we on purpose. Wholly
Jamboree. It's Jamboree week. I can't be held accountable.
Hey, man, are you there?
No, this afternoon.
I haven't been in like 3 years.
Well, it'll be the same if you come back in another 3. It
I'm
won't be
pretty-
very different.
Pretty sure it'll be the same. Yeah, pretty sure. This video actually, guys, is actually really good. It's very good, very well done. And if you're like me and you watch it and then they do all, the suggested videos after, you can go down the rabbit hole if you want.
Cool.
But she
Thank
does a
you.
really good job. So yeah, I'd check that out. All right, everyone, have a great weekend. And I think we're going to meet one more time. When are we meeting again?
On the 5th.
Is it the 5th? On the 5th, we're going to talk about adulthood.
Real quick, Dr. DeVore,
Yep.
assignment 3 is due on the 29th,
Exercise 3 is due on the 5th.
on the 5th. The same day we have class, right?
That's correct.
Okay. And what about the form?
The forum is the next. You always have a week between.
Okay, so.
All you guys have is and then the final in the paper.
The paper is due on the 13th, right?
That sounds right.
November 13th?
13th. That's right.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
All right.
Okay.
Run and be free, people.
Great weekend. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank
Dr.
you.
Bedard, great class.
you.
Great class.
Thanks all.